If you've ever wondered what it takes to transition from the back office to the boardroom and go about managing billing and accounting to becoming a CFO at top firms, you're in the right place. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are thrilled to have you join us for today's webinar. Today, we have the incredible opportunity to hear firsthand from Madhu about his journey, what challenges he faced, the pivotal decisions he made, and the skills that helped him rise to the top. I'm Nilabja, your host for today. I lead content at Zenskar, and I couldn't be more thrilled to dive into this conversation. Madhu, can we start by having you introduce yourself to our audience?
Thank you, Nilabja. I've been a finance professional my entire life. I started my career way back in 1996 when I joined Ernst& Young in Bangalore, in India. And over the last almost 30 years at this point, I've grown up the finance ranks, initially in an accounting function. Then I was in the FP&A function. I grew up the FP&A ranks. I became a CFO for the first time around the 2017, 2018 timeframe. I've been a three-time CFO at this point, and I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Awesome. So, leading on from there, if someone today was in the role you were in 7 to 10 years ago, how
Mhm.
should they think about their trajectory over the next few years to get to the CFO role?
Mm. I'll say the most important thing is not to get too hung up on titles. I would say that a lot of people are so focused. I want to become a CFO. I want to be called a CFO. I think every finance professional can think and feel like a CFO every day when they show up for work and think about ways to deliver value to the business every single day. And then the title will come chasing you automatically. So you don't need to chase the title. So I think the first biggest thing is always be in service of your business. And you don't thrive as an individual if your business doesn't thrive. And so do everything that you can in your capacity to identify the most pressing needs of your business and find ways to contributing to those needs. And I think that's the formula that always works. It doesn't matter, whether you're 7 years out or 10 years out or 20 years out. If you show up every day with this mindset, the title will come chasing you even if you don't want it.
Awesome. And what about the mindset shift that is required for you to be able to transition from the operations uh,
Mhm.
of the financial world to thinking more strategically about finance and about business by and large?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to take keen interest in the business, really understanding why does this company exist, what are the company's products, who are the customers they're trying to serve, what is the unique value proposition of this business, how are we going to market, how are we positioning the company. I think if you take a lot of interest in that, study the landscape, study the industry overall, observe your competition. If there are podcasts out there that you can follow and listen to, do that. Finance operations are great, they're very important, no doubt. But if you really want to be a strategic partner to the business, you genuinely need to take interest in that. It is not something that you do because it'll help you grow. You want to do that because you genuinely are interested in learning the business.
And on a personal note, what helped you make this switch, from the operation side to the strategic side? What were the resources that came in handy for you that you think would also be applicable and have sort of transcended
Mhm.
time and would help finance professionals now more than ever?
Yeah, I think I was extremely lucky. I'll start off by saying that, I was there at the right place at the right time. I used to work for a company called Wipro Technologies, a very large, very successful, high growth company in the late 1990s when I had a very, very supportive senior management team that were willing to take the bet, take a risk on me. I only had about 2 or 3 years of work experience under my belt in an accounting role when I went up to my CFO and I basically asked him if I could get a strategic finance role. I thought I would get laughed out of the room. I actually fully expected that. I was prepared to hear a no, but I still wanted to go up to him and ask him what it takes to become one. Honestly, deep down, I thought it would be at least another 5 or 7 years before they would think that I was ready. I expected my CFO to tell me that you need to still show growth, accomplishments, win the right to get there. But he was willing to take the bet on me. And so honestly, I don't know what he had that day for breakfast, but it certainly worked out. He was in a good mood, I suppose. I half kid actually. But nevertheless, it was many, many conversations over several months. It feels like it all happened overnight. It wasn't the case. But I was genuinely interested in the business. I learned a lot about the business. I had a lot of mentors within the company. It wasn't a small company by any means. At that time, Wipro was already doing about $250 million in revenue. So there were plenty of people within the finance function. So I observed people who were doing very well in the company, learned from them, and made sure that I expressed enthusiasm for the role.
Learning from people around you is great advice. As much as you learn from the great things that they do, you also learn from their mistakes. So, when you were trying to move into leadership, what were some of their mistakes that you think you learned from, or what were some of the mistakes that you made when you were trying to make the switch in the transition that you would ask finance professionals to steer away from?
Yeah. I'll speak to one particular mistake that I made very early in my career. And I was responsible for the billing, invoicing, and the AR operations of Wipro Technologies. Like I mentioned to you, we were about $250 million in revenues, and we had a centralized function that was responsible for producing invoices to our customers, keeping track of those invoices, tracking collections, reporting on AR, and things like that. And I was 21 years old. And, I was given a three-member team. I had no prior experience being a people manager, but nevertheless, here we were, a team of four people, including me, that were producing invoices to our customers. And we had no great technology at that time. We honestly would collect timesheets from various software project teams, and we would run Excel macros. And these timesheets, by the way, were all sent to us in Excel. And we would run Excel macros to take all that data and produce invoices out of it and send it to our customers. And it was full of errors. There was never a month where we would actually send invoices that were accurate. Almost every single time, our customers would come back complaining about mistakes in the invoice. Or in many cases, customers would receive an invoice, but they'd pay a different amount. And then we'd try to figure out what happened. And because these invoices were being sent in Excel, somewhere along the way, someone would choose to make changes to an invoice. And so every single month, we had challenges. It was extremely frustrating. Everybody up and down the management chain was frustrated. And I was, right in the middle of all this. I was in the epicenter of this problem. And when I looked around and tried to figure out what was going on, I figured that a lot of these problems were coming from those timesheets that were being sent to us, to our central billing team. And when I looked behind the scenes to figure out who was producing these timesheets, there were a bunch of people across the company that were called as invoice coordinators. They were completely decentralized. They were embedded within the business, and there were many, many of them. I don't remember the exact count. I'd say maybe a dozen of them, right? And my solution, or at least my proposed solution at that point, was to go to my CFO and tell him, let's centralize this team. Let's bring all these invoice coordinators into a single pool that I will oversee, and I will then fix all these problems. So I went with this proposal to my CFO, and he heard me out. And then at the end of it all, he said, "Nope, not happening. I don't think this is something that will happen. Go back to your desk and figure out another way to do it." And I was extremely disappointed, right? I had worked on this proposal for weeks. I had thought through how I wanted to defend this proposal, how I was going to sell this idea. Went back to my desk, extremely dejected that this was not happening. And I felt almost helpless, right? I was like, next month is going to roll around. We're going to make the exact same mistakes, and then we're going to have the exact same problems, right? And so I sat at my desk and I was thinking about what to do. And out of complete desperation, I remember writing an email. I drafted a very long email addressing all these invoice coordinators, and I almost pleaded them. I said, guys, if you all can send us accurate timesheets, we can actually try to minimize these errors. And here are some of the types of errors that we've seen. Here are ways we can potentially fix these timesheets. I need your help. Let's work together. one team, one problem, we can fix it, right? So I sent this giant email and I CC'd my manager. And within 10 minutes of me sending that email, my manager came running to my desk and I thought I'd done something wrong. I was like, oh my God, I'm in trouble, right? And he said, now you get it. And I said, what do you mean? Like, what did I get? He said, the solution always is not to expect people to report up to you and that somehow then you can fix those problems. Sometimes in life, when there are problems, you may have to just be an influencer. You may not have direct authority over some people, but you can influence them. You can actually go and work with them even though they're not part of your team. So think of this invoice coordinator team as an extended team that isn't officially reporting up to you, but nothing prevents you from being a leader, reaching out to them, working with them, finding solutions. They all want the same thing too. Nobody likes to cause problems. Everybody wants to be part of a solution, except that sometimes they have a different idea and you have a different idea as to how to get there, and you'll have to work with them. And everything changed for me thereafter. When he said those words to me, I felt so encouraged that within a few days, I set up a meeting with all these invoice coordinators. They were all in different buildings across the city. We all met in person. We talked about all the issues that we were having. They had no idea what they were doing, they had no idea how many problems were being caused. And so, that type of a collaboration mindset that I didn't have prior to that, because of the encouragement of my manager, and thankfully my CFO didn't just simply give me all those people to be on my team, right? He actually said, go find a different solution. It worked out in my favor long term.
Right. I have two follow-up questions to that.
Mhm.
One of them is that how a company manages its billing is something that involves various stakeholders. Of course, you have the primary stakeholder, who's the CFO, and then there are various other stakeholders who are influencing that decision. Back then, you were also influencing that decision, and you were able to get everybody on board with this idea that you put forth.
Mhm.
In various companies, when if a person is an influencer and not probably somebody who's primarily invested in taking that decision, how do they get a leg in when it comes to putting
Mhm.
forward their viewpoint, so that what can come forth is the idea that they are thinking strategically about finance and about business.
Yeah. We can speak about this very specific billing issue and maybe we can zoom out and look at some broader learnings from all this. I think, especially when it comes to invoicing and any customer facing activity, I think the influencing is actually easier. And I say this because nobody within a company wants to see wrong invoices go out to customers because you lose credibility, you lose trust, customers are unhappy, and you definitely don't want to make them unhappy. And I think if you can, whether it's your sales team, whether it's your finance team, engineering team, whoever might be a stakeholder, I think it's a very easy thing to be able to go demonstrate to them with actual examples of escalations you've received, service tickets that have been created, identifying errors that have actually taken place, where a customer might actually feel that we knowingly invoice them more than we should have. And I think that's a terrible place to be. If I were a customer and I received an invoice from a vendor and I couldn't take it on face value and I have to check it, I've created work for a customer. That is a terrible place to be. And I think one can go there with data, with actual facts, with anecdotes, and really speak to how this could impact the business overall. An unhappy customer, especially when you're doing everything else right. You have a great product, you have great branding, you've done a lot to acquire a customer, and then of all the things, you cannot produce an actual invoice that is actually accurate. That would be such a shame. It's a completely controllable thing. It's something that you should be able to fix. And I think that really helps get the support of all your stakeholders, everybody from sales to engineering to product to even accounting.
Right. And my follow-up question to that would be that, is that the framework that you would say you most recently used when you have to get buy-ins from all the teams?
Mhm.
And what were you doing differently earlier as opposed to now? How has getting buy-ins from all the teams evolved or changed over the years?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I've learned is that every team has their own agenda sometimes, and they're trying to optimize for a certain metric that is really important to them. So, as an example, your customer success team probably is optimizing for customer retention and all the retention metrics that they're goaled against, right? Whether it's an NRR metric or a GRR metric, and they're singularly focused on that. Your sales team might be really, really focused on new logo acquisition or bookings, and they are singularly focused on that. And sometimes when you are really focused on one metric, you might do that at the expense of some other metric. So, as an example, if you have a sales team that's feeling a lot of pressure to acquire a new logo and to sign a contract, and if they are able to do anything they can to get that deal, they're likely to agree to custom terms, contract terms that you're typically not too used to seeing. Or they might change language in a contract in a way that actually helps the customer but at the same time introduces a lot of complexity or ambiguity into a deal. That is something that you will typically see when you empower sales teams to go out and close a deal at any cost. They will sometimes introduce freebies like a free trial or deferred payment schedule or some other complicated mechanism for giving discounts to customers, such that their commissions are protected, but at the same time, they're trying to pass on some economic value to the customer. And when you have those types of custom contracts, sometimes execution against that contract becomes very challenging. And so once you understand that every team is gold or they're optimizing for a certain metric or a certain set of OKRs, you can start to understand some of their behavior. You can start to anticipate what might happen, and you can try to anticipate and get ahead of those types of issues and try to clarify them.
Right. And would you say then that the metrics that the CFO focuses on also differ based on the stage the business is at? Like at different stages of the business, they would focus on different metrics. Like how has that evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing to do and the laziest thing to do is to simply introduce so many metrics that suddenly your QBR or your weekly business review has like pages and pages of metrics. It almost looks like a manual that a pilot will use inside a plane, like literally like a yellow pages directory or something. Like, and so when you start to do that, sometimes it's really hard to identify problems. And so it's really important to contextualize where the business is at, where you need to focus and identifying the right kinds of metrics and also putting in place the processes and the systems that will help you actually calculate and report on those metrics in a reliable way. I think it's super important because you can create a metric, you can even provide a definition for it, but if you don't have the right processes or systems to do it, you might be spending an inordinate amount of time trying to even report on it. And I've seen companies for a weekly business review that literally happens every week by definition. People will spend 2 to 3 days of that week preparing for it. And why are they preparing for it? Because they're scrambling, trying to find data from different systems, trying to reconcile them, trying to make sense of them. And you literally wasted half of your time just producing those metrics, and you've not had enough time to understand why the metrics are what they are, what are the root causes, what are some solutions. You don't have any time for any of that because all that you're doing is trying to reconcile those metrics and trying to make sense of it.
Right. That makes complete sense. And at what business stage would you say does a company typically hire a CFO?
Mhm. Yeah, I think there are different levels of finance leadership. Typically, what you will see companies do initially is to hire a director of finance, maybe even a VP of finance, to bring about some level of analysis and rigor into the business. And that's perfectly fine and understandable. When a company is starting to think about an exit, they've reached a certain scale, they've reached a certain level of maturity. Maybe they've been in business for 7, 8 years and they're thinking about their initial investors and planning for an exit. That's when you really need a CFO because you need a CFO who's really, really strong with investor relations management, very strong with fundraising, is able to think about various exit options, whether it is an IPO or a sale to a private equity firm, or maybe it's a strategic sale. Those are times when a CFO can think very strategically, look at the business for what it is worth, really understand what is the competitive landscape and what might be the most optimal exit mechanism. I think a CFO really adds value. When the company is at an earlier stage, I think they will be well served to have a VP of finance or a director of finance, very strong FP&A skills, has some experience hiring people, building small teams. I think that's perfectly fine at that point.
Right. And as a company grows in revenue and headcount, how would you say the function of finance and the different roles within it, whether it's director of finance, whether it's CFO, etc., how do they evolve with the growth of the company?
Yeah, I think the pace of growth is going to be super important as well, because you might have a company that feels small or young, but the reality is because they're in the right place at the right time, they're growing really fast. And if you are growing so fast and you're trying to keep up with your business, sometimes you may have to plan for some of these roles a little bit early. So while I say that, look, company probably needs a CFO when they're thinking about an exit, I think in a lot of cases they might be growing so fast that you're trying to plan ahead of time. So that's an important one, because it's not that you're hiring for yesterday or day before yesterday. You're really hiring for tomorrow. And especially certain roles like a CFO role, it takes time to find the right one. And so you may want to start a search early and spend some time, spend a few months meeting many different candidates, different backgrounds, different profiles. So I'll say that is important too. But having said that, I want to go back to your question. If you don't mind, can you repeat your question so I make sure that I haven't missed something?
Yeah. I meant to ask that as the company evolves,
Mhm.
the function of finance within
Yeah.
it and the
Mhm.
different roles in it, whether it's billing manager, director, VP, CFO, they also sort of come into the picture. So, at what stages of the business do they come into it, and how do the different roles sort of evolve as the company grows?
For sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say the earliest hires within a finance organization tend to be bookkeepers, accountants who are able to pay bills, process payroll, file taxes, and remain compliant, right? So you typically have a set of bookkeepers who are keeping the lights on. Maybe you need an accounting manager so that at the end of the month, you're doing your reconciliations, ensuring that you're closing the books accurately and reporting on your financial results, right? I think that's the earliest set of people that you hire. You're going to need a controller when you know that you're getting ready for an audit. Typically, getting your financials audited means that you need to be GAAP compliant. You need to have some level of technical accounting knowledge. A controller will typically be very good at that. Ideally, comes from a public accounting background and therefore knows what it takes to get financials audited. And so, a controller will do a really good job steering the company through their first year of audit. And so that's on the accounting side. On the FP&A side, you will want to hire your first FP&A person when you know that you want to create a financial model, understand your underlying business drivers, really trying to understand, what is your forecast going to be. That's a little bit more nuanced and sophisticated than just making up numbers, right? So I'd say typically you start with an individual contributor. Again, depending on the scale and size of the company, this person might be called an FP&A analyst or an FP&A manager or a director of finance, but nevertheless, typically starts off as an individual contributor, and then you can build a team around that person. Once your business is complicated enough, you might need someone who's only focused on revenue modeling. You might need someone who's only focused on COGS. Maybe you need a person focused only on OpEx. Again, depends a lot on complexity of the business and the scale of the business. And so you start to specialize within the FP&A function. Then there's a third function, which is my personal favorite, which people might call it strategic finance. Some companies will call it business finance. Some CFOs will embed this within the FP&A function. They don't like to split out FP&A and strategic finance. They like to have a pool of resources that will, on demand, move back and forth between doing traditional forecasting versus doing strategic work. But I think it's super, super important because that's the set of responsibilities or projects that will allow a CFO to truly contribute in a very strategic way to the business, evaluating pricing models, evaluating commission structures, evaluating new product lines, all of these types of things that are very ad hoc in nature. You don't necessarily know what's coming down the pipe always. You might have a handful of projects that you're working on, but your business needs change constantly and you're constantly thinking about new things that you need to go evaluate. And that's where the strategic finance function comes into play.
And based on your experience, would you say that there is one select professional who is most involved in selecting a billing system? Like, is it a billing manager, director, CFO? Like, one who is the most active and who has the final say per se? Like, would you say, based on your experience, there's someone like that, or would you say that uh, I mean, a lot of buy-ins are taken into consideration?
Yeah, I'd say the controller is probably the one person that I would look to be completely on top of evaluating, shortlisting, and ultimately making a selection for a robust billing system that supports the company's needs for today, but also for tomorrow. And I say this because there is an operational element to all this. You want to obviously keep track of all your contracts, produce accurate invoices and whatnot, but then you also need the same person to understand technical accounting, understand RevRec rules, understand how it integrates with your ERP system, ensuring that your AR, cash, all of that is also managed well. And so typically a controller, given that person's scope and broad oversight, will be able to look at all of these aspects and be able to make an informed decision in close consultation with the CFO, no doubt. And to the extent that there is some engineering help required, also work very, very closely with the engineering teams. There are some businesses and some business models that are pretty straightforward. A billing system may handle that out of the box. Maybe you don't need any engineering help. It's plug and play and you can implement straight away. There might be many other businesses where the source data is coming from a different system. And you may need to keep track, especially businesses that have a usage-based billing model based on API pings and so on and so forth. You really need to work very closely with engineering because you want to make sure that these systems are well integrated, talk to each other, are flexible enough that as the businesses evolve, change, and you have new product lines and whatnot, that this product will actually keep up with the times. And so you definitely want to make sure that the engineering team is very closely involved.
Right. And what would you say were the biggest challenges you faced vis-a-vis handling RevRec and with ASC 606 compliance that led you to take the decision of figuring out the best possible software out there that serves your company's needs to handle
Mhm.
RevRec?
Yeah, I think, we'll talk specifically about Lob, which is the company that I worked at most recently as their CFO. The company had multiple products. There was a product that typically worked like a SaaS business model. That product was typically subscribed to by our customers on an annual basis or a multi-year basis. And so the RevRec rules that applied to that product was different. We also had a usage-based business that worked, not as a SaaS product, but literally based on how the company used the product. It was completely variable in nature. And within that usage business, we had multiple SKUs and we also had multiple tiers of pricing. It was typically volume based. And so a customer might be billed at a certain rate up to a certain volume. And then once it reaches that threshold, you had to change the rate. And then lastly, we had extremely complex sales tax rules that we needed to apply within our business. It wasn't straightforward at all. It's bad enough that in the United States, you have a different tax rate in different states, and there are all sorts of rules around zip codes and whatnot. And then on top of that, given that we had multiple products and each of them had their own sales tax rules, it was extremely complex. And so we recognized very early on that if we had to remain compliant and do the right thing for the business, we needed to look at a more robust product that would actually address all of these things.
Right. And what would you say was one finance automation tool or process you implemented there that
Mhm.
had the biggest impact on your efficiency and your and compliance by and large?
Yeah. I know this isn't, straightforward finance, but nevertheless, implementing a CPQ system is, super critical, especially when you start to have a lot of bespoke contracts with customers with unique pricing arrangements. And for those of us here who don't know what CPQ is, it's essentially an automation platform that will help sales teams produce quotes that can be submitted to customers that can then be integrated into your CRM system, whether it is Salesforce or HubSpot or whatever. The quote when signed by a customer will automatically integrate typically with the CRM system, and you can essentially import all that information and thereafter think about invoicing and RevRec and whatnot. What we recognized within our business was that there were lots of bespoke contracts, lots of custom deals, lots of unique contract language, and a lot of this was being done through Word documents, Google Docs, Slack, email. And so it was extremely hard to keep track of what was going on within the business. And a lot of times, the accounting team or the finance team might find out only after the contract is signed that it was including certain terms that were almost impossible to implement within our billing system. Our billing system was homegrown. It was built by in-house engineers many, many years ago, extremely brittle and very susceptible to breakage. Anytime you try to modify code within our billing system to try to accommodate a new requirement, we would almost invariably break something else. And we would have hundreds of customers receiving inaccurate invoices because we introduced a new bug. And so it was really, really important for us that we needed to be very selective about when we actually had custom contracts or unique pricing arrangements, unique billing arrangements, because we didn't want to run the risk of basically breaking it for hundreds of other customers. And so we felt that a CPQ system would allow us to completely streamline who gets to modify a contract. And if that modification needs to happen, who gets to review it, who gets to approve it, so that we can always be on top of these types of changes. And so I would say that that had a huge impact in minimizing the number of downstream problems that we had.
And were you, as a finance leader, involved in finding, selecting, and implementing the CPQ, or was it someone else within the
Yeah.
team?
Yeah, I had a project manager within my team that was responsible for finance transformation. Her only role was to take on special projects that involved identifying automation opportunities or streamlining processes. And so she would work in very close partnership with the accounting team, with the revenue operations team, sales leadership, with myself, and basically orchestrating any project like this. And so her mandate was to essentially go out to market, solicit proposals from multiple CPQ vendors. We reached out to our network to ask for referrals and recommendations as well. We looked at the reputation of all these vendors in the market, ultimately shortlisted a small number of vendors that we evaluated. And all of this was done in a very collaborative fashion in partnership with the revenue operations team, the accounting team, the sales leadership, because ultimately the CPQ system needs to be used by sales reps. And we wanted to make sure that this wasn't a finance only decision that would receive a lot of pushback after the fact. Because if there is people are not using it and they're continuing to go back to their old ways of doing things, then we will have wasted a lot of dollars implementing a system that is actually not being used.
Right. So, from what I'm hearing, is that as a general rule, finance and sales together
Mhm.
are most involved in selecting a CPQ.
Correct. In some cases, a revenue operations team might take the lead because they may be very, very closely involved with the sales teams on a day-to-day basis, and they may be seeing the pains involved in getting pricing approvals or generating quotes, and so they may take the lead. But typically, best practice would be to work in close partnership with the accounting team to make sure that ultimately the CPQ tool talks very well with the CRM system and maybe other accounting systems, maybe an ERP system, for example, so that there is very tight integration and the approval workflows for pricing and other contract terms work for us so that the in-house legal team, the deal desk, all of these people are able to contribute very effectively within the CPQ workflow.
Right. And after implementing the CPQ at Lob, what were the key metrics that the finance team was tracking to measure the efficiency
Mhm.
of the revenue operations?
Mhm.
And how would you benchmark them against industry standards?
Yeah, I think the easiest benchmark is how were things for us before and how has it changed thereafter? Because a lot of times you may not always get great benchmarks around the turnaround time for producing a quote or the speed with which a quote gets approved. These are not widely published benchmarks. You might be able to go and try to find something through a Gartner or something like that, but it isn't something that you would just get off the shelf, right? And so for us, honestly, prior to implementing a CPQ, our workflow was entirely Slack dependent. We actually had a dedicated channel in which sales reps would type out messages requesting a quote for a specific deal. Someone from deal desk would get involved, produce spreadsheets, which in turn would then be converted into a proposal, which would be a Word document or a Google Doc that would float around in a very ad hoc fashion. People would review it, whether it's legal or the price, deal desk itself, right? And so it was very hard to keep track of when a request was initiated, who is supposed to act on it, who is working on it, how long, what are the SLAs for turnaround time, and things like that. When you have a CPQ system, everything gets time-stamped. You can actually measure response times, resolution times, and how quickly you're able to get a proposal out to a customer, because sales teams work extremely hard to find an opportunity. And when they do that, and they've taken weeks, months to finally get to the right stakeholders, and they're finally interested in our product, you want to be able to submit a quotation to them almost immediately. The fact that then you go back and work with back office, and that's going to take a few weeks, that opportunity might just go away. The stakeholder might change, his or her mind. Maybe a competition will come in and take advantage of that, wait time. So you need to be extremely nimble and responsive. So I'd say the most important metric is how quickly are you able to address a prospect's needs or a customer's needs? How quickly can you get a quotation out? Has it been reviewed by everybody, the right people, so that it's not like some person sitting in a corner typing out a Word document and sending it out, but actually the right people have reviewed it.
Right. And how would you say in the past have you still helped the sales team win when they
Mhm.
found an opportunity, but they, wanted to bend the rules?
Mhm.
And that I'm assuming would often get some pushback from the finance team because
Yeah.
that would complicate things for them.
Mhm.
So, how does then sales and finance work in accordance with each other in
Yeah.
such a
Yeah, I'll tell you an actual story, and then I'll probably tell you some lessons learned from that along the way. And this goes back many, many years ago when I used to still work at Wipro Technologies. And we had a very large strategic customer that was based out of Michigan, in Detroit, to be specific, an automaker. And automotive companies are notorious for their procurement practices. They are ruthless about what they expect from their vendors in terms of pricing, and they will run very, very tight RFP processes where they will lay out requirements, and you as a vendor have to meet those requirements to qualify to even submit a proposal. And if you don't, then they will eliminate you almost immediately. And they will treat, it doesn't matter whether you're supplying parts or whether you're an IT vendor or whether you're supplying software, it doesn't matter. They will treat you like a vendor, and they will literally have check boxes for whether you met a certain requirement or not. And if you did not meet a certain requirement, you're out of the mix, right? So extremely difficult to work with. Um, Nevertheless, this particular customer of ours was an existing customer, no doubt, but at the same time, they were looking to expand their sourcing and their strategic relationship. There were millions of dollars at stake. But unfortunately, the RFP had a requirement that the chosen vendor would have on-site presence in Detroit to service the client. And Wipro's business model was one where almost all of our execution used to happen from offshore. We did not have physical presence in the United States. We would sometimes send resources to work out of client offices. And so think of it like staff augmentation, right? We would send people to work out of the client's offices, but we definitely did not have a physical office footprint. But this particular deal required us to establish that footprint, and it meant investing maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars to establish a physical presence that was simply not acceptable to Wipro's management at that time. They said this breaks our business model. This is not how we do business. There is literally no value in creating a physical office. So the mandate from the Wipro management was go back to this company and tell them that it makes no sense. This requirement should be removed from the RFP process, and we can then compete for this business. But procurement was extremely stubborn about it, were unwilling to remove that requirement, and we were basically in a bit of a bind, right? On the one hand, as a finance person, I don't want this deal to not be profitable. But at the same time, I also don't want to lose the deal because it's an extremely important deal, a strategic deal, a really big logo, with millions of dollars of revenue potentially down the stream. But procurement being procurement would not commit to volumes, right? They would be like, nope, you will you will simply satisfy this requirement. We cannot tell you what the volumes are, but we will give you business and it's going to be huge, right? And so, super difficult situation to be in, but I was very empathetic with the sales team. I flew down to Detroit. I used to live in India back then. I flew down to Detroit, asked that I meet with the procurement team to really understand why this requirement was introduced into the RFP. I thought I was going to be a master negotiator or something, that I would be able to walk into this room and figure out a way to make this all happen. And I basically had redlined the RFP and I had actually put comments in there, and I had emailed it to them ahead of time. And when I went in to meet this procurement person, he walks into the room and he looks me in the eye and he says, "Do you know who I am?" And I'm like, "Your name is Kevin, right?" And he's like, "No, I am GM procurement. And if this is my requirement, you're going to meet our requirement. Every other vendor has agreed to meet this requirement. So either you meet this requirement and you're going to be considered, or I will take this to be your decision not to participate in the bid." So it became very clear to me that negotiating with this customer was not going to happen. We had to come up with something more creative. And so for the first time ever, these days we talk about lifetime value of a customer and things like that, right? It's a very fancy term that we use in the SaaS world, especially. This was 25 years ago. There was no such concept, at least not officially. But I went back to the Wipro management and I said, guys, this customer is going to be worth X million dollars in Y time frame. And I actually created a model out of it. I created a spreadsheet to show how this investment could be recouped and could be recouped fairly quickly. So there was a break even point that will come in a matter of time. It's just a matter of how quickly. And I took personal responsibility and I said, look, if this thing doesn't work out and it becomes unprofitable, you can make me responsible for it. I was literally putting my job on the line and I said, I have confidence that this account will be worth a lot more and we need to make this investment. And maybe we don't need to invest in Detroit. Right across the river, there is a lower cost option. It's called Windsor in Canada. Let's go back to GM. Let's talk to them about potentially setting up this facility in Windsor. It is not a big deal. In terms of time distance, it's not much at all. And so they wouldn't be able to tell that, oh, these are people sitting in Windsor versus Detroit. They're in the same time zone, same city, even more or less. And so we actually came up with a compromise arrangement. Wipro was willing to make that investment. We went back to GM and we said, look, we're going to set up this facility in Windsor, not in Detroit. They somehow were amenable to it. We were able to strike a deal, and that account is worth a lot more to Wipro today. But back then, it took a fair amount of quote unquote creative thinking and a lot of stubborn conversations to make it happen.
Right. I mean, this is a great example of how finance can be a driver of growth rather than, just a control function. And helps me understand how, you collaborated with sales to play this very critical role in closing a high stakes deal. At the same time, I'm wondering, how do finance leaders balance flexibility in billing with maintaining
Mhm,
financial controls? Like, do you have a
mhm,
personal process or a tool that
mhm,
helps you balance it
mhm.
out?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think you want to strive for flexibility, no doubt. And you definitely want tools and infrastructure in place that will allow you to support potentially multiple business models or multiple pricing arrangements. So flexibility is definitely important. But at the same time, there aren't an infinite combinations of business models or pricing models. No matter what tool you have, chances are it will at some point have some limitations, and you're not going to be able to bend those limitations beyond a point. So I think you definitely want to work with and find tools that are as flexible as possible, but at the same time recognizing that there are some guardrails that you need to put in place, because when you have too much flexibility, it can also cause a lot of confusion. There's a reason why when you walk into an Apple store, you only have certain number of SKUs. In fact, I'd argue that now there are too many SKUs, even within Apple devices. Um, But there's a reason why people will sometimes prefer going into an Apple store because you only have two or three options to choose from. When you have 25 options, when you walk into a Best Buy and you find 25 different Windows PCs, it's really, really hard sometimes to pick the right one. And similarly, if sales teams have 25 different ways in which they can quote to a customer and they actually go and present those to a customer, they might be overwhelmed as well. Sometimes there is something to be said about simplicity and having a finite number of choices of ways in which you can invoice a customer because you can actually create a situation where there's analysis paralysis. Customers are not able to decide if one option is better than the other option, and therefore it slows down decision making also for them. You want to make it fairly simple and straightforward for them. So all that said, there is a reason why sometimes some companies will choose to build tools in-house because they believe that by having an in-house engineering team and having full control of the infrastructure, they can customize it, in infinite ways. It might seem fine at first, it never ends well, from what I can tell you. At some point, your engineering teams will turn over. You will have attrition and you'll have new engineers. There might not be great documentation. You're not in the business of creating infrastructure. Your primary focus is on solving your customers' problems. And so when you try to manage some of these things in-house, chances are things will break, especially as you start to grow and there's more complexity. So it's fine in the early days or something, but the sooner you go to a professional vendor who does this for a living, who supports thousands of customers, chances are they've looked at almost every edge case. They have engineers waking up every morning thinking about how to support a product. So, between do it on your own, have something in-house versus finding a third-party vendor, I think ultimately a third-party vendor wins ultimately. It's just a question of when and how.
Yeah, I mean, those are some super insightful takeaways. I think my final question for you is going to be that what is your advice for CFOs who are doubling up as a strategic enabler of sales, especially in the modern world? Since you've done this and you have experience in this, uh,
Mhm.
what is your advice to them? What are some of your learnings that you're willing to share with them? And what are some high level takeaways that they can take from this webinar?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'll say the first thing is listen in on customer conversations. It's one thing to sit in an ivory tower and try to make up rules without having fully understood what those customer interactions look like. You can make a whole bunch of assumptions as to what might be going on, especially these days. A lot of these customer meetings are taking place online. Almost always, people are using recording tools. Almost every leading vendor out there offers these capabilities, and these calls are being transcribed and documented. You have access to all of this. So I'd say, even if it feels like a lot of time at first, uh, try to listen in on many different customer type conversations, whether it's a renewal conversation or a new prospect. All of these are very different types of conversations. It could be an upsell conversation. Listen in on some of these. In fact, I would say ask your sales teams or ask your sales leadership what might be good examples of customer calls that you should listen into. Good calls, bad calls, because you'll see all the different edge cases that take place in those conversations. If you find that there is one particular sales rep that is doing extremely well, closing a lot of different deals, very high win rate, listen in on some of those calls to see what this person is doing right. If there are some other sales reps who are not doing very well, listen in on some of those calls as well. See what's going wrong in those calls. What might be struggles that they are having. You might say, hey, that's what sales leadership is supposed to do, or that's what RevOps is supposed to do. That's what sales enablement teams are supposed to do. And that's all perfectly true. But I think as a finance leader, you need to have a lot of empathy for how hard it is to sometimes close sales deals in a very competitive environment where customers have a lot of choices and they're calling the shots. It's very, very hard. In fact, I'd argue try to close a sales deal of your own. If it's a product that you can speak about, it's not a highly technical product, maybe it's a product that you yourself use on a day-to-day basis. Make the case for why you should just be assigned a lead. Maybe it's a qualified lead that's coming from your pipeline, and try to talk to that customer and try to convince them. You will learn a lot. There's a reason why Starbucks will insist that their leadership team should go out into those coffee stops and actually be a barista for a few days. There are a lot of companies that do that. Some of these logistics companies will ask their leadership team to go actually drive those trucks or deliver packages. You got to do that too sometimes to really understand what this looks like.
I like how actionable that advice is. In fact, can't wait to implement it at Zenskar. Um, that's super helpful. I mean, thank you so much, Madhu, for talking to us. I'm sure the audience has had plenty to take away from